At my granddaughter's wedding, I noticed my name tag said, "The old lady who's paying for everything." I smiled and pinned it to my dress like it belonged there. If you've ever had a moment where you realized exactly how people see you, stay with me. I'd like to know where you're watching from. The venue was everything they had described. White roses lining the aisle, soft gold lighting draped across the ceiling, tables set with crystal glasses that caught every bit of movement in the room. It was elegant, carefully planned, expensive in a way that didn't try too hard to look expensive. I arrived early. I always do. It gives you time to take things in before everything becomes noise. A young coordinator greeted me near the entrance with a practiced smile. "Welcome," she said, reaching for a small tray of name tags. She didn't ask my name. She already knew. That was the first detail I noticed. I picked up the tag she handed me, glancing down without thinking. And that's when I saw it. Not grandmother of the bride. Not even my name. Just a printed line, clean and intentional. The old lady who's paying for everything. For a second, I thought it might be some kind of misplaced joke. Something meant for someone else. Something that had been switched or printed incorrectly. But nothing else about this event looked accidental. Everything was too precise. I ran my thumb lightly over the edge of the tag, feeling the smooth plastic beneath my fingers. No hesitation in the printing. No sign of error. Deliberate. I looked up briefly. The coordinator had already moved on to greet the next guests, her expression unchanged, as if what she handed me was perfectly normal. So, I didn't question it. I didn't ask. I simply pinned it to my dress. Because sometimes it's better to see how far something goes before you interrupt it. Inside, the room was beginning to fill. Guests moved easily between conversations, laughter rising in soft waves, glasses clinking gently as servers passed by with trays of champagne. A few people greeted me as I walked in. Polite smiles, light touches on the arm. But their eyes lingered just a second too long on the tag. Then back to my face. Then away again, as if they had already understood something about me that I hadn't been told yet. I returned each smile calmly, nodding where it felt appropriate, saying very little, because by then I wasn't confused anymore. Not entirely. I just hadn't decided what it meant yet. Across the room, I caught a glimpse of my granddaughter. She stood near the center, surrounded by friends, her dress catching the light with every small movement. She looked happy, exactly as she should have. For a moment, I allowed myself to see her the way I always had, not as part of this room, but as the little girl who used to hold my hand before stepping into new places. That memory didn't disappear, but it didn't quite fit here anymore. Someone passed behind me and spoke quietly to another guest. "Well, at least she's useful." A soft chuckle followed, not loud, but clear enough. I didn't turn. I didn't react. I simply stood there, one hand resting lightly at my side, the other adjusting the edge of my sleeve. Because in that moment something settled. Not anger, not even hurt, just understanding. I wasn't here as family. I was here as something else. And the name tag was the most honest thing in the room. I didn't take the name tag off. Not when I stepped further into the room. Not when the music swelled slightly as more guests arrived. Not even when I noticed the way people adjusted themselves around me, subtly, carefully, as if they were trying not to be obvious about what they had already read. Because removing it would have meant pretending it wasn't real. And by then, I knew it was. A server passed by with a tray of champagne. I took one without hesitation, offering a small nod in return. The glass was cold in my hand, the bubbles rising quietly to the surface. Normal. Everything around me was designed to feel normal. I moved slowly along the edge of the room, not searching for anyone in particular, just observing. That's something you learn over time. If you don't rush to fill silence, people tend to reveal more than they intend to. Near one of the tables, a small group was gathered, speaking in low voices. I didn't approach them directly. I didn't need to. "Well, I mean, she offered, didn't she?" one of them said. "I guess," another replied. "Or maybe she just never says no." A soft laugh followed. Either way, it worked out for everyone. I took a small sip of the champagne, my expression unchanged. Worked out for everyone. That was an interesting way to describe it. Across the room, I noticed my son, Daniel, standing near the bar. He looked comfortable, engaged in conversation, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested everything was exactly as he expected it to be. For a moment, I watched him. Not as he was now, but as he had been. A boy who used to ask before taking something that wasn't his. A boy who once understood the difference between being given something and assuming it would always be there. That memory felt distant. Not gone. Just replaced. As if somewhere along the way, the rules had changed and no one had thought to tell me. I shifted my gaze slightly, letting it move across the room until it settled on her. Claire. She stood near the center, speaking with a group of guests, her expression warm, her movements measured. Everything about her was composed, intentional, perfect in the way people are when they know they're being watched. For a brief moment, her eyes met mine. Not long, but long enough. She noticed the name tag. Of course she did. Her gaze dropped to it for just a fraction of a second, then returned to my face. No surprise. No apology. Just acknowledgement. And then she smiled. Not at me. Through me. Before turning back to her conversation as if nothing had happened. That was the second detail I noticed. Because people who don't know react. People who do continue. I set the champagne glass down on a nearby table, untouched now. My hands came together lightly in front of me, fingers resting against one another in a way that felt natural. Steady. Because by then, something had already shifted. Not in the room. In me. This wasn't about a careless joke. It wasn't about someone making a mistake with a label. It was about a role. One that had been decided without ever being spoken out loud. And standing there, in a room filled with people who seemed perfectly comfortable with that version of me, I realized something quietly. They didn't see me as part of the family. They saw me as the reason the room existed. I didn't confront anyone. Not Claire. Not Daniel. Not even the guests who spoke a little too freely when they thought no one important was listening. Because by that point, I wasn't looking for explanations anymore. I was listening for confirmation. And it came easily. It always does, when people believe you've already accepted your role. I moved toward one of the side corridors where the noise softened just enough to separate conversations. The kind of space people use when they think they're being private but aren't quite far enough away. Two voices drifted toward me. Familiar ones. We had to keep it simple, Claire was saying, her tone calm, almost rehearsed. If we made it about her being grandmother of the bride, she might start thinking she has a say in things. A short pause. Then Daniel's voice. Lower. Less certain. She's still my mother. She's also the one funding this entire event, Claire replied smoothly. Let's not confuse roles tonight. Roles. The words settled differently now. I remained where I was, just out of sight, not moving, not interrupting. Because this was the part no one intended for me to hear. And the tag. Daniel asked quietly. Another pause. Small. Measured. A reminder, Claire said. For everyone. Including her. No hesitation. No softness in it. Just clarity. I didn't stay long after that. I didn't need to hear anything else. Because once something is said without resistance, it usually means it's been believed for a while. I stepped back into the main room, the sound of music and conversation rising again around me, as if nothing had changed. But something had. Not outwardly. The tables were still set. The guests still smiled. The bride still laughed at something someone whispered near her ear. Everything looked exactly the same. But now I understood the structure beneath it. Every detail. Every choice. Every decision. None of it had included me. Not as family. Only as function. I walked slowly past the reception table again, my fingers brushing lightly against the edge as I passed. The stack of remaining name tags sat neatly arranged, each one labeled with titles, relationships, identities that meant something. Mother of the bride. College friend. Cousin. Defined. Recognized. I didn't stop, because I already knew what mine said. And more importantly, I knew why. Near the center of the room, I caught another glimpse of my granddaughter. She looked radiant, her smile effortless, untouched by anything happening around her. For a moment, I wondered if she knew, if she had seen the tag, if she had agreed to it, or simply allowed it. But that question didn't stay long, because whether she knew or chose not to know, the result was the same. I adjusted the brooch on my dress gently, straightening it out of habit. A small, steady motion. The kind you make when you're preparing yourself, not for a reaction, but for a decision. Because by then, something inside me had already settled into place. Not anger, not hurt, something quieter, clearer. If this was the role they had chosen for me, then it was time I decided whether I was going to keep playing it. I didn't go back to them. Not to Claire. Not to Daniel. Because there was nothing left to clarify. What I had heard wasn't said in anger. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't even hidden particularly well. It was simply how things were. And once something is that clear, asking questions only gives people the chance to soften it, to reshape it into something easier to accept. I wasn't interested in that. I walked slowly toward the far side of the room, where the lighting dimmed slightly and the noise softened into something more distant. A place where people passed through but didn't stay. That's where you think best. I paused near one of the tall windows, looking out briefly at the evening settling outside. The glass reflected just enough of the room behind me, movement, light, laughter, layered over the quiet stillness beyond it. Two worlds, one I had been placed in, and one I was beginning to step into. I let out a slow breath, barely noticeable, and adjusted my posture slightly. Not because I needed to appear composed, but because I was. That was the difference now. Before, I had been trying to understand. Now, I understood. And that changes how you stand. My thoughts moved back, not in a rush, not in fragments, but in a steady line. The deposit for the venue, the caterer, the flowers, the band. Every invoice that had passed across my desk over the past months. Every temporary arrangement that somehow became permanent without discussion. Every time someone said, "We'll sort it out later." Later had arrived, and I was standing inside it. I reached into my purse and took out my phone, holding it loosely in my hand for a moment before unlocking the screen.
No urgency. No hesitation.
Just a quiet decision moving into action. I scrolled briefly, contacts, recent calls, until I found the name I was looking for. Martin. He had handled my accounts for years. Careful, precise. The kind of man who didn't make assumptions. I stepped a little further into the shadow of the corridor before placing the call. He answered on the second ring. "Good evening," I said calmly, my voice even, as if this were no different from any other conversation we'd had. There was a brief exchange, simple, direct. No explanations that weren't necessary. "I'd like you to review all outgoing payments connected to the event tonight," I said. A pause on the other end. Not confusion. Just attention. "And for now, hold anything that hasn't been finalized." Another pause. Slightly longer this time. "Is everything all right?" he asked carefully. "Yes," I replied. "Everything is clear." That was the truth. I ended the call without elaborating further, slipping the phone back into my purse with the same steady motion. Nothing outward had changed. The music continued. The guests laughed. Glasses clinked softly in the distance. But something fundamental had shifted. Not in the room. In the foundation beneath it. I stepped back toward the light, re-entering the flow of the evening as if I had never left. No one stopped me. No one noticed the difference. Because decisions like that don't announce themselves. They unfold. Quietly. I returned to the center of the room as if nothing had changed. Because on the surface, nothing had. The music still played softly. Guests still moved from table to table. Laughter rose and fell in. Gentle waves just like before. And yet I noticed something different now. Not in them. In how I saw them. A woman I had met once before approached me with a bright smile, her eyes briefly dropping to the name tag on my chest before lifting again. "Oh, you must be so proud," she said warmly. I held her gaze for a moment. "I am," I replied. That part, at least, was still true. But pride and participation were not the same thing. She nodded, satisfied with the answer, and moved on without asking anything further. Because no one was really asking. They were confirming. confirming the version of me they had already accepted. I continued walking, slower now, more deliberate. My fingers brushed lightly along the back of a chair as I passed, grounding myself in the space, not emotionally, but physically. This room, this event, all of it had been built with a kind of quiet certainty that I would simply be there. Not as a voice, not as a presence, but as a resource. Near the far table, I noticed one of the event coordinators speaking in a low voice into her headset, her expression briefly tightening before smoothing out again. A small detail, but noticeable. A second later, another staff member approached her, whispering something quickly. Their eyes shifted, just slightly, across the room.
Toward me.
Then away.
Subtle. Careful.
But not invisible. I didn't react. I didn't need to, because I already knew what they were responding to. A help payment doesn't create noise. Not immediately, but it creates questions. And questions spread quietly at first. I picked up another glass of champagne, more out of habit than intention, holding it loosely as I watched the room adjust in ways most people wouldn't notice. A delay here, a hesitation there. Nothing obvious enough to cause concern, but enough to shift the rhythm. Across the room, Claire was still smiling, still speaking with guests, her posture as controlled as ever. But once, just once, I saw her glance toward the coordinator. And this time, the coordinator didn't smile back. That was the third detail I noticed. Because control, when it begins to slip, doesn't break all at once. It flickers. Claire recovered quickly of
course.
She always did. Her attention returned to her guests, her voice steady, her expression warm. But the ease was gone, replaced by effort. Daniel, on the other hand, had started to move. Not toward me, but around the room, checking in with people, his steps slightly less certain than before, as if he had sensed something shifting without understanding what. I remained where I was, still, unhurried, because this wasn't about creating a scene. It was about allowing one to form naturally. I set the champagne glass down again, untouched, my hands coming together lightly in front of me.
Calm, steady,
present, because by now, the evening had begun to change direction. And the most important part was this. I hadn't said a word. Not yet. But somehow, everything was already starting to move. The shift didn't happen all at once. It never does. At first, it was just a change in timing. A pause that lasted a second too long. A quiet exchange between staff that didn't quite resolve. A glance that lingered before quickly looking away. Small things. But small things add up. I remained where I was, near the edge of the main floor, giving myself a clear view of the room without becoming part of its movement. That was always the best place to stand when something begins to unfold. Near the bar, I noticed one of the coordinators speaking more urgently now, her voice still controlled, but faster. Another staff member joined her, nodding as she listened, then stepping away quickly toward the back hallway. No one else seemed to notice. Not yet. Because guests don't look for problems at events like this. They assume everything is handled. That's part of the illusion. Across the room, Daniel had stopped moving. He stood near one of the tables now, his attention fixed on the same coordinator. His posture had changed, subtle, but clear, less relaxed, more aware, as if he could feel something shifting but couldn't quite see it. Claire noticed it too. She turned slightly, following his line of sight, her smile holding for just a moment longer before it faded into something more controlled. Not gone, just adjusted. She said something quietly to the couple beside her, excused herself with a polite nod, and began moving across the room. Not quickly, never quickly, because urgency draws attention, and Claire never allowed that. I watched her approach the coordinator, her expression composed, her voice low as she spoke. From where I stood, I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. The reaction was enough. The coordinator hesitated, just for a second, then responded. Claire's posture shifted, barely, but enough to reveal that this wasn't part of the plan. That was the fourth detail I noticed, because when someone like Claire loses certainty even slightly, it shows. Daniel moved closer then, joining them, his gaze moving between the two of them, searching for something solid to hold on to. A question. An explanation. But neither came easily.
Not this time.
I adjusted my sleeve lightly, the fabric smooth beneath my fingers, grounding in a way that had nothing to do with nerves and everything to do with control. Because that's what this was now. Not reaction.
Control.
A server passed by again, slower than before, his eyes flicking briefly toward the staff gathered near the side. He didn't stop.
He didn't speak.
But the rhythm of the room had changed. Subtly. Noticeably. The music continued, but it no longer filled the space the same way. Conversations still happened, but they broke more easily, drifting into shorter exchanges. Something unspoken had begun to spread. Not panic. Not confusion. Just awareness. And awareness changes how people behave. I took a small step forward, just enough to re-enter the flow of the room, but not enough to draw attention. Because I wasn't finished observing. Not yet. Across the room, Claire straightened slightly, her composure returning piece by piece as she turned back toward her guests. But this time, it wasn't effortless. It was managed. And that's how you know something has already shifted too far to ignore. I didn't smile. I didn't move toward them. I simply stood there, exactly where I was meant to be seen. Because by now, the evening wasn't running the way they had planned. And I still hadn't said a word. By now, the room had settled into something quieter. Not silent, but different. The kind of difference people don't talk about, but adjust to. I could see it in the way conversations shortened. In the way laughter didn't quite carry as far. In the way people began to glance, not directly, but often enough to notice a pattern forming. Something was off. They didn't know what, but they felt it. Near the center, Claire had regained her position, speaking again with a small group of guests. Her voice was steady, her posture composed, every movement measured just as before. But now, it required effort. That was the difference. Control. When it's natural, flows. When it's forced, it tightens. And Claire, for the first time that evening, looked like she was holding something in place. Daniel stood a few feet away from her, not fully engaged in any conversation. His attention moved across the room more than it settled. Every so often, his eyes returned to the staff near the side corridor. Then briefly to me, not long enough to be obvious, but long enough to register. I didn't respond. I didn't nod. I simply held my position, allowing him to look and then look away. Because this wasn't about acknowledgement. It was about recognition. A server passed behind me, adjusting the placement of glasses on a nearby table. His movements were careful, slower than they needed to be, as if he had been told something but not everything. That's how these things move. Information travels in fragments, and people fill in the rest. Across the room, I noticed one of the coordinators step out briefly, her phone pressed to her ear now. Another followed a moment later, speaking in low tones, her expression no longer neutral. The structure was beginning to show its strain. Not broken, but no longer seamless. I adjusted the brooch on my dress again, a small, familiar motion. Grounding. Because everything I needed to understand, I already did. This wasn't about money anymore. Not really. It was about assumption. Expectation. The quiet agreement that I would continue to give without ever needing to be seen. And now that agreement had been interrupted. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But clearly. Near the stage, someone tested the microphone briefly. A soft feedback hum filled the air. For just a second before cutting off. A signal. Not planned, but timely. Claire's head turned slightly at the sound. Daniel's attention followed. A few guests shifted in their seats, anticipating the next part of the evening. Speeches. That was what came next. I let my gaze move toward the microphone, then back across the room. This was the moment everything would settle, or shift completely. And for the first time that evening, I allowed myself to consider not just what I had understood, but what I was going to do with it. I took a small step forward. Not enough to draw attention. Just enough to move out of the background. Because staying silent had already done its work. And now, it was time to decide if I would remain in the role they had written for me, or step into one they hadn't planned for at all. I didn't rush toward the microphone. That would have drawn attention too early. Instead, I moved the way I had all evening, calm, unhurried, as if I were simply following the natural flow of the event. Because timing matters. And this wasn't a moment you force. It's a moment you step into. Near the front, a small group had already begun to gather, anticipating the speeches. A few guests adjusted their chairs, turning slightly toward the stage. The staff moved with quiet coordination, making final adjustments that felt just a little less seamless than before. I could see it in their eyes now. Awareness. Not of me, but of something unsettled beneath the surface. Claire stood just off to the side of the stage, speaking briefly with the event coordinator. Her voice was low, her expression composed, but there was a precision to her movements now that hadn't been there earlier. Measured, controlled, maintained. Daniel lingered a few steps behind her, his posture no longer relaxed. His gaze moved between the coordinator, the stage, and the guests beginning to take their seats. Then, briefly, to me. This time, he didn't look away immediately. There was a question there, unspoken, but present. I held his gaze for just a second, then continued walking. Because I wasn't there to answer questions. Not yet. A member of the staff stepped toward the microphone, tapping it, lightly before speaking. Ladies and gentlemen, if we could have your attention. The room responded gradually, conversation softening, movement slowing, attention shifting forward in small waves. This was the part of the evening everyone expected, the part that followed a script. Introductions, speeches, gratitude, everything in its place. I stopped just short of the front, positioning myself where I could see clearly and be seen if I chose to be. Not hidden, not central, exactly where I needed to be. The coordinator began introducing the first speaker, her voice steady, professional, unaffected by anything that had begun to ripple beneath the surface. Claire stepped forward slightly, her smile returning, polished and familiar. She glanced briefly at the room, then toward the microphone. Everything about her suggested control had been restored. But control, once interrupted, is never quite the same. I adjusted the edge of my sleeve once more, a quiet habit, my fingers steady, because by now the decision had already been made. Not in that moment. Earlier, when I chose not to remove the name tag.
When I chose not to react.
When I chose to understand before acting. This was simply where that decision would be seen. The first speaker finished. Light applause followed, polite and expected. The next name was called. Another speech. Another round of soft laughter. Everything moving forward, just as planned, until it wouldn't. I took one final step closer. Small, unremarkable, but intentional, because silence had carried me this far. It had allowed everything to reveal itself, without interruption. And now it was time for something else. Not louder, not sharper, just clear. I stepped forward just as the applause from the previous speaker began to fade. Not abruptly, not in a way that demanded attention, just enough to be noticed at the exact moment people were already looking toward the front. That's the difference. You don't interrupt the room. You let the room make space for you. The coordinator glanced in my direction, briefly surprised, but not enough to stop me, because from where she stood, I still looked like part of the plan. I reached the microphone and placed my hand lightly against the stand, steadying it before speaking.
No rus, no hesitation.
Just presence. Good evening, I said, my voice calm, carrying easily across the room without needing to be raised. The last few whispers settled. Not completely silent, but close enough. I hadn't planned to speak tonight. I continued. A small pause. Actually, I wasn't sure I was expected to be part of the evening at all. That landed. Not loudly, but clearly. A few guests shifted slightly in their seats. I didn't look at them. I didn't need to. Instead, I let my gaze move gently across the room, unhurried, steady, before settling for just a moment near Claire and then Daniel. Not accusing, not searching, just acknowledging. I arrived earlier, I said, and I was given a name tag. Another pause. I imagine some of you noticed it. A subtle ripple passed through the room.
Small,
but real. I reached up and touched the edge of the tag lightly, not removing it, just enough to draw attention without making a display of it. It didn't have my name, I said. It didn't say grandmother of the bride. I let that sit for a second. Then, it said a breath. Not for effect, just timing. The old lady who's paying for everything. This time, the silence was different. Heavier. More focused. I lowered my hand again, letting it rest calmly at my side. I thought at first it might be a mistake. I continued. But as the evening went on, I realized it was probably the most honest introduction I've been given in a while. No edge.
No bitterness.
Just clarity. Across the room, Claire's smile had disappeared completely now. Daniel stood still, his expression fixed somewhere between understanding and something else he hadn't quite named yet. I've always believed that supporting your family is something you do quietly, I said. You don't keep track. You don't ask for recognition. You just show up. A brief pause. And I've done that. Gladly. That part mattered. Because this wasn't about denying what had been given. It was about redefining what it meant. But tonight, I added, I was given a different role. I let my eyes rest on the room again, not searching for reactions, just allowing the words to settle where they needed to. One that made things very clear. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't change my tone, because I didn't need to. And clarity, I said softly, is a very useful thing. I let that last word settle.
Clarity.
It stayed in the air longer than anything else I had said.
Because people understand that word, even when they don't want to.
I kept my posture steady, my hands relaxed to my sides, my gaze level with the room. Not fixed on any one person, but aware of all of them. This evening, I continued, has been beautifully arranged. A small pause. And I mean that sincerely. That mattered. Because truth, when it's acknowledged honestly, carries more weight than anything exaggerated. The venue, the details, the atmosphere, I added, letting my eyes move briefly across the space. Everything reflects a great deal of care. Another pause. And a great deal of investment. That landed differently.
Subtly.
But clearly. I didn't need to explain what I meant. They already knew. I've always believed, I said, that when you give to your family, you don't do it for recognition.
A breath.
You do it because you want to see them happy. I let that thought sit for a moment. And I've done that, I added, without hesitation. That was important, because this wasn't about rewriting the past. It was about redefining the present. But tonight, I continued, my voice unchanged. I was given a different understanding of my place here. I reached up again, briefly touching the edge of the name tag, not removing it, just acknowledging it. And I've chosen to take that understanding seriously. The room didn't move. Not physically, but something in it tightened. Expectation. Uncertainty. Both at once. So, I said, in the interest of clarity, a small pause. I've asked that any remaining payments connected to this event be placed on hold.
No emphasis.
No dramatic shift in tone. Just a statement. Simple. Final. For a moment, there was no reaction. Not because they hadn't heard me, but because they were still processing what that meant. Then it began. A slight movement near the coordinator. A quick exchange between two staff members. A shift in posture from Daniel, subtle, but unmistakable. Claire didn't move. Not at first.
But the stillness itself said enough.
I'm sure everything will be resolved, I added calmly. Just not in the way it was assumed. That was the line. The one that closed the gap between expectation and reality. I didn't look for approval. I didn't wait for a response. Because none was required. This isn't about taking anything away, I said, my tone softening just slightly. It's about making sure that what is given is understood. A final pause. And respected. The silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was defined.
Clear.
I stepped back from the microphone then, releasing it gently as if nothing significant had just happened. Because from where I stood, nothing had been taken. Only something had been returned. I stepped away from the microphone without looking back. Not because I was avoiding anything, but because there was nothing left to address. The room didn't erupt. It didn't need to. The silence that followed carried far more weight than any reaction could have. At first, no one moved. Guests remained seated, glasses still in their hands, expressions caught somewhere between confusion and realization. Because what had just happened wasn't loud. But it was unmistakable. Near the side, the event coordinator was already speaking into her headset again, this time more urgently, her voice low but quick. Another staff member approached her, their exchange brief, focused, no longer concealed by practiced smiles. The structure had shifted, and now it was visible. Daniel was the first to move, not toward the guests, not toward the coordinator.
Toward me.
His steps were measured, but not as steady as before. There was something in his expression now that hadn't been there earlier, something heavier than confusion. Understanding. Or, at least, the beginning of it. "Mom," he said quietly as he reached me.
Just that. No explanation.
No defense, because even he didn't seem sure where to begin. I turned slightly toward him, my expression calm, unchanged. "Yes." He hesitated. For a moment it looked like he might say something more, offer an explanation, perhaps, or try to reshape what had already been made clear. But then he didn't. Because some things, once spoken plainly, can't be adjusted back into comfort. "I didn't know," he said finally. The words came out softer than expected, not convincing, not entirely certain, but not entirely false either. I held his gaze for a moment, long enough to let the statement settle. "I believe you," I replied. And I did, at least in part, because not knowing doesn't always mean not being responsible. And we both understood that. Behind him, Claire remained near the front, her posture still composed, but no longer effortless. She was speaking with the coordinator now, her tone controlled, but her movements sharper, more precise. Managing, trying to restore something that had already shifted too far. Her eyes lifted briefly, meeting mine across the room. This time, there was no softness in them, no performance, just calculation. And something else, recognition. She knew exactly what had happened. And more importantly, she knew she hadn't been able to stop it. I looked away first, not out of avoidance, but because there was nothing left to exchange between us. Around us, the guests had begun to move again, slowly, carefully, voices returning in lower tones, conversations forming in fragments rather than flow. The evening hadn't ended, but it wasn't the same event anymore. Daniel stepped back slightly, as if unsure whether to stay or follow after Claire. That choice wasn't mine to guide. It never had been. I adjusted the edge of my sleeve one last time, a small, familiar motion. Everything about me remained steady, unchanged. But the room around me had finally caught up to the truth I had understood much earlier. I didn't stay long after that. There was no reason to. The evening continued, of course. It had to. Music returned, softer this time, as if even the sound understood it needed to adjust. Guests resumed their conversations, though not in the same easy rhythm as before. Something had changed, and no one could quite pretend it hadn't. I stood there for a moment longer, not watching anyone in particular, just observing how everything settled into its new shape.
Claire
was still near the front, speaking in low, controlled tones to the coordinator. Her composure remained, but it was no longer effortless. It had to be maintained now. Managed. Daniel had stepped away, his posture quieter, more inward. He didn't approach me again. He didn't need to. Some conversations don't happen out loud. Across the room, I caught a glimpse of my granddaughter. She stood surrounded by her friends, her smile still in place, but softer now, less certain. For a brief moment, our eyes met. She didn't look away immediately, and in that moment, I saw something shift. Not fully, not completely, but enough to matter. I gave her a small nod. Nothing more, because whatever she chose to understand from tonight would come in her own time. I reached up and touched the name tag one last time, my fingers resting lightly against it. The old lady who's paying for everything. I had worn it the entire evening. Not because I accepted it, but because I needed to see it clearly before I decided what to do with it. Now I removed it, slowly, carefully, and placed it on the nearest table. Not discarded, not hidden,
Just set down.
exactly where it belonged. I picked up my purse, smoothing the fabric of my dress out of habit. The same small, steady gestures I had made all evening, because nothing about me had changed. Only what I allowed had. I turned toward the exit, walking at the same calm pace I had maintained from the moment I arrived.
No rus. No hesitation.
No need to look back. The doors opened, and the cool evening air met me gently as I stepped outside. The sounds of the reception softened behind me, fading into something distant, something that no longer required my presence to continue. For years, I believed that being part of a family meant giving without question, showing up without condition, staying even when your place became smaller, quieter, less defined. But tonight made something very clear. If the only role you're given is the one that benefits others, then you're not being included. You're being used. And once you understand that, truly understand it, you don't argue. You don't explain. You don't try to earn your place back. You simply step out of the role with dignity, with clarity, with everything that was always yours still intact. I walked toward the waiting car, the city lights stretching quietly ahead of me, not leaving something behind in anger, just choosing not to carry it anymore. Because I was never just the one paying. And for the first time that evening, I was no longer playing along.